Well, hello everybody. Today we're at home with the Dynatrons again. We've covered Dynatron before in these videos. This one here, the Dynatron Gypsy, is one I did quite a while back, and it's one of my favourites actually. I quite like this radio, and therefore I was tempted by a couple more of the things from the same era. This was one, if you remember, I had to do a bit of adaptation on it because it took two 6-volt batteries that you can't get anymore. So I used a couple of PP3s and then put some regulators in, but it's still going pretty well. As I said, it's one of my favourite sets. Of the same era are these two. So that one was the Gypsy. This one is called the Nomad, which I suppose got some sort of relationship in terms of brand, but doesn't look really anything like it, apart from its red. But that one was predominantly plastic sort of construction. This is much more solid wood, metal type stuff. Big chunky controls, I mean big chunky handle for a start. Look at the metal on that. And these controls are very nice and solid. I like these. These feel really strong, really nice clunky things. Nice tuning action there. Obviously all these radios just long wave and medium wave. There's no VHF on these, which I suppose limits their eventual lifespan. Maybe we'll discuss that later on. Big speaker here, and also has the twisty turntable thing for aligning your aerial to the AM. If we pull the back off it, there's some interesting stuff in it. It requires two PP9 batteries, which we have got. This connector has fallen off here, so we'll have to solder that back on. Big speaker here, made by a company called R&A, which I've not heard of before, but it looks really, it's a really nice finish. The other interesting feature, I think, is these two separate ferrite rod aerials. So we've got the long, which looks like the long wave coil on that one, the medium wave coil on that one. Why did they do that? I mean, obviously there's room to do it because it's a big case, but what's the advantage of doing that? Why not just do what everybody else does and put the medium wave coil with the long wave coil on the same rod? I can't really see there's any advantage in that, although maybe someone whose knowledge of electromagnetic field theory is more up to date than mine might be able to help us out on that. Anyway, you know, it looks pretty a pretty nice sort of set. It looks pretty well built. I'm guessing there may be a few capacitor issues, it being that old, but to be fair, we didn't really have that very much with the other Dynatrons, so I'm sort of hopeful. This bit of string here, I think, was intended, because there's a thing here, I think it was intended to stop this coming down too far, but I don't know quite how to fix it back on. Yeah, so that's the Nomad. Then we have another one, done in a more tasteful grey finish rather than the gaudy red that we saw on the other two radios. This one's called the Dual, but you can see that the Dual, and all of these are made at the same time, and this is the interesting thing about Dynatron. There's somehow style between this one and the Nomad, but nothing between this and the Gypsy that we looked at in the earlier video. And they can't even get the, I mean, even the Dynatron logo is different between the two sets. So I'm not sure they were that big on house styling. I quite like the grey colours they've selected on this, if you can call grey a colour. This is, unfortunately, the paint's come off the scale a bit, but it's still quite usable. And also the tone control here, instead of being labelled high, low and medium, has the more creative options of speech, jazz, orchestra and mellow. What that actually means in practice, I suppose we can find out by putting some sound through it. Again, feels not quite as chunky as the other one, but feels good, feels solid. The only thing I would say about this one is that it does look as if the case has got a bit bashed at some point, because it doesn't quite line up, so it looks like somehow it's got distorted, but it's all just bits of wood screwed together, so hopefully we can do something about that. The fact that the case has got a bit distorted makes it a bit hard to get the back off, but we can do that, and if we get the back off of it, we can see obviously a more compact solution than the other one. They've gone back to the normal thing of having the two coils on the ferrite. This third one is for the external aerial, which the other set, oddly enough, doesn't have. The other thing is these batteries. Now, this uses two PP7 batteries. PP7 is a 9-volt battery, not a 6-volt battery, but again, they're not, you can get them, but they're about 20 quid each or something like that. I'm not paying 40 quid for batteries for this. And the odd thing is some batteries came with it, which obviously are very, very dead indeed. There was also a receipt, which sadly I've lost. But the receipt was from the year 2000 when these batteries are purchased, so it's not entirely surprising that they've run down. They have, however, not leaked, which is a good thing. And I'm thinking maybe, rather, I mean, my initial thoughts is, well, we convert this to PP3s. Obviously, there's a nice sort of bracket here to hold these two PP7s. Maybe we could hollow out these PP7s and turn them into PP3 holders and put the PP3s in there, and then we don't have to modify that and put any different fixings in to hold those. So that's a possibility that I'm thinking of at the moment. The other thing we notice in here, it's an AF series transistor, so we could be in for a little bit of pain here. Anyway, we can get these things powered up. I'm going to start with the red one because that's easier to do, and we'll see what we get. Well, I repaired the connector and put the batteries in, and it's good news and bad news. Good news is it does work on both medium wave and long wave. Bad news is even on very high volume settings. That's full volume and it's quite quiet. Also, this tone control appears to have no effect, so it's not brilliant. It does work on long wave as well, same thing. I would say probably then we're looking at capacitors in the audio stage that probably need replacing before we can get any decent sound out of this, but it's promising. Now, with a lot of these older radios, we tend to take the view that the electrolytics, especially ones that look like this, are ripe for replacement and probably likely to be rubbish, but that the other capacitors, especially if they're ceramics, are usually okay and you don't need to touch them. However, given that the tone control here wasn't working, I thought I'd take a look at the capacitors around that. Now, these are these old sort of Hunt's capacitors, and whenever you see these, that's generally a bad smell. They're usually pretty rubbish. I checked these, they are quite a bit below the capacity they should be, and also very high resistance. So yeah, taking both of those out and I'll replace them. The thing that did confuse me, now looking at this switch here, you can see that it's got two 0.1 microfarad capacitors down to ground, and as you switch these in, but why would you have 2.1 microfarads? Surely that would mean no difference, because here it's open circuit and then it's got a 0.1 down to ground, and if you switch it to this position, it's got a 0.1 down to ground. So why does it make any difference? What I think this little arrow here is supposed to make clear, but didn't to me until I actually measured it out, was that in fact this is a progressive switch. So when you make this one, these two contacts are joined, and when you make it again, all three contacts are joined, and that is what gives you the, so now you've sort of doubled the capacitance that's down to ground here. Well, we've replaced all these capacitors, and there's some good news and bad news as usual. The good news is we got much better volume now.
And you believed it. When they all started, he was not so much influenced by the comedians before.
So it's working pretty well on long wave.
His own special way of doing comedy. The whole
Tone control doesn't sound to have a massive effect, but it is working. I don't think it was ever intended to have a massive effect as far as I can tell. I put the same components in, and it, you know, it's all there. The only problem I've got, first of all, this knob is a bit split, which is annoying, which makes it a little not quite steady on the shaft. And the other thing is, whereas it works here on long wave,
amongst your other achievements,
you can tell it's not quite on where it should be, because it should be on around 1500 here and it's on 1400 when it's tuned into Radio 4. Also, medium wave no longer works and has a bit of a whistle on it. So we're going to have to look into why the medium wave doesn't work now.
So yeah, we have to be really careful about how we label and bracket players, because we also can put a lot of pressure on them, and our job is to try to make the environment.
Yeah, the medium wave's working again now. Bit of a schoolboy error really, missing decimal point or misreading a decimal point on replacing one of the capacitors. So I put a 220 nanofarad capacitor in instead of a 22 nanofarad capacitor. Having corrected that problem, it's now working. It's probably just as well now that I'm retired from working in the finance industry, isn't it? Anyway, all seems to be sorted. The only thing is, I'm finding it quite difficult to get the medium wave alignment right, in that it doesn't, you know, in getting it to line up properly with the places where it should be on the dial. Now, one of the issues I've got with this is the coil that I want to tweak, which is this one here, is proving a bit resistant, and I'm always a bit worried about messing about with these, because you can see how some of the sealing is coming out there. If it doesn't turn, it's very unwise to try and force it with things this age, because what happens is that the ferrite inside it then disintegrates, and basically you're in the scrapyard unless you could find another one of those, which is pretty unlikely really. So I'm tempted to stay with the thing not being properly lined up on the scale and still receiving stations, rather than it being completely broken. So again, we don't get a completely perfect result, but it's cleaned up pretty well. I took quite a lot of the old Plessey electrolytics and Hunt's non-electrolytics out of it, and that does seem to have improved the performance. Now, I know I say quite a lot on these videos that I'm not one for wholesale replacement of capacitors. That's because quite often you take a radio and the capacitors don't need replacing, so why bother? This one, in this case, the audio was so bad and the performance was so bad that obviously at least one capacitor would have needed replacing. And when you're in that situation, it's usually better to do them all once you've got the thing out, rather than have to keep taking it apart, putting it back together, trying it out or whatever. You might as well do the whole lot. So that's just an advance rebuttal of any comments about inconsistency in my approach to these things. Anyway, so I think that Dynatron, the Nomad, is now sorted out, so we can have a look at the Dual. So, as I said, we wanted to try and get adapt these old dead PP7s to hold some PP3 adapters. So I've taken one of them, and you can basically get this bottom part out with the aid of flattish pliers and a screwdriver, and obviously straighten that up and tidy it up later. Inside there, you can see that there's the effectively the positive terminal right at the top there, which you'll have to connect onto, and the negative one is this strip coming from the bottom, which goes all the way up and connects onto that one. Now that's because this is the actual cell, and this drops out once you take the bottom off. You can push it out from the top, and it just rests on that. So that's always got to get disposed of, and then we can work out how to get a PP3 adapter secured and wired into that case. Well, I have to say I've spent a lot more time on this set than I expected to. I'm not entirely convinced it was totally worth it, although I think it is a nice set. There were a few things that I came up with. Obviously we got PP3 adapters into here, so it looks as if it's got PP7s in it, but it's been powered by a couple of PP3s. The other thing, there were a couple of capacitors I thought were off, so I took the same approach that I did with the Nomad and just thought, well, I'll just replace a lot. Now, the other thing was a lot of the components around the tone control. In fact, this entire input section here before the driver transistor, where the tone control is constructed, including that transistor, we're all not on the main circuit board, but we're on a tag strip or connected across the multi-way switch for the tone control. Now, this isn't an unknown type of construction, especially with the old valve radios, and there's nothing particularly wrong with it. The problem is you get things to be a bit older like this. The switch tags get a bit fragile, and it becomes difficult to get all the components into place without breaking one or two of them off. Now, we can take advantage, and I did in this case, of the fact that components are much smaller size nowadays. So what I did was I put all of that stuff on a little piece of Verboard here, rather than, and just wired the switcher, wired away from the switches up to that with a couple of flat connectors. In order to do that, I had to do a bit of extra spacing out of the aerial, and that meant I had to add some metric screwage to this British radio. Although screw geeks like me will know that BA screws are actually based on metric anyway. And it all seemed to be working fairly well, and it struck me that we'd had no problems with any of the AF117 transistors, which is unusual. Anyway, I put it all back together, and within a few minutes it stopped working. And obviously I was then spent a lot of time looking at the stuff I'd done, thinking obviously that's the thing that stopped it working. But actually what had happened was the AF117 transistor in the mixer oscillator position had failed, so I've replaced that and it's all back to normal again now. In terms of the case, yeah, a screw had come out of it, so that's why it had sort of distorted, so I screwed the case back together. It didn't make it any easier to get the back on and off. In fact, it's made it harder to get the back on and off, which is a bit annoying. But otherwise, I'm pleased that it's come back and it's all working pretty well, and the alignment was pretty good without me having to touch much. I did adjust the long wave to get that in, but that's about all. Let's just have a quick listen to it.
Home time with Bush and Richie. Toasty Tuesday returns. You're not going to believe what we're going to attempt.
Mince pie in a toasty. Don't mind if we do.
This afternoon from 4.
So actually it makes quite a good sound now it's fixed. I'm still not sure about the real significance of why they had these different labellings of the tone positions. The speech one seems to be very thin indeed. The mellow one is probably one I'd leave it on most of the time, to be honest, and I can't tell a massive difference between orchestra and mellow. The interesting thing I thought about this circuit is that when you look at it, we noted that you have to have two 9-volt batteries to operate this, and this is quite a common thing at the time, to have a split power supply like this. But when you look at it, the second battery here is only really used for the audio stage. If you look at the feed to the, well, certainly the first part of the audio, the input transistor here, the one that I relocated to the Verboard, that is fed from this 470 ohms. And if you look at that, that comes straight off of, where are we going? Straight off of this battery. In other words, there's only 9 volts on that stage, so everything back of that is 9 volts. The only thing that's 18 volts is push-pull output stage. Now, I've seen 9-volt push-pull output stages that work perfectly well. Even, they're using OC81 transistors, but that wasn't uncommon. I'm not sure why it was necessary to have two batteries, really. It does go very loud, it has to be said, and maybe that was a consideration, but there you go. Also, this tone control, as I said, is a bit of a bizarre thing, and I've not ever seen anything like that in any other set, and certainly not in the other Dynatron set, which, as we saw, was much simpler. And that one also, the Nomad, also has a battery, a split battery, which is really only effective for the output stage, although it's a different design. I suppose we have to address the question, I did raise this earlier in the video, is what's the future for these things? The BBC has said, well, the BBC said a few months ago that it would stop doing AM broadcasting after 2027. It's now said in the last couple of months that it intends to stop broadcasting altogether, as in, there will be no transmitters, there will be no aerial reception of any sort. All it will be streaming. And, you could say, well, that's still broadcasting. That's a matter of opinion. I don't think it is. I think once you're onto streaming, you're not really broadcasting. It's point-to-point transmission. And they know everything you've listened to. And they know when you turn it on and when you turn it off. Do they actually care about that? No, I don't think they're going to track every person and say, I'm sorry you turned off Radio 2 when we said something offensive or whatever. I think in the aggregate, though, they want that data. It has to be said, this is probably a shrinking audience for AM on most of the stations. I suspect 5 Live and Talk Sport still have a fair bit of listening. If 5 Live went, would Talk Sport stay? I'm not sure. I can't remember whether Talk Sport is owned by the same company as Absolute Radio that we just heard. There's a sprinkling of stations like Leica and other Indian Asian-based radio stations, and I suspect their specialist content will keep them there. But again, they're all available on the internet, so perhaps they'd disappear as well. I think it's one of those things where once the big players start to leave, it's going to be very expensive for anybody else to stay there. So what do we do with these sets? Do we just throw them in the bin? Do we go for what some people have done, which is wholesale gutting of them and using them just as a fancy sort of Bluetooth speaker? I'd rather not, really. I think if you were going to use it as a Bluetooth speaker, you could probably go straight into the audio stage and it would sound pretty good. Or you could put a little AM transmitter in there and you get the original AM sound. Why would you want that, I suppose? Why would you want 4.5 kilohertz compressed sound like that? And if you wanted that, you could always achieve it anyway. I mean, I could always get the genuine AM sound on this channel by knocking the top down and putting a bit of compression on it. Good afternoon and welcome to Neil's Old Radio, where we'll be playing a lot of mellow orchestral jazz. There won't be much speech, and because it's only 1961, there won't be any popular beat combos yet. And if the BBC is going to stop broadcasting on FM as well, then a lot of our other radio sets that we're trying to preserve wouldn't be useful either. I suspect they won't get away with ditching FM that quickly. I think that all of this is a bit of kite flying by the BBC because they want to preserve the licence fee, and I think they've come up with a thing that if you don't let us have the licence fee, we'll switch everything off. It's basically, we'll smash the place up if we don't get what we want, sort of toddle a tantrum type thing, which they're quite well known for, to be honest. But it is something we're going to have to face, and maybe that's something we need to look at in a future video, is how we can take one of these sets and adapt it to be useful in the modern age and not dependent on broadcasters with their 10-minute attention spans. Anyway, that's enough today. Thanks for watching. See you soon.